And what I've noticed is that often they're not good things. One of those is cockroaches. I hate cockroaches. Anybody kind of with me in that? Yeah, I think all of us seem to be in this category. They were all around the town that I grew up in. And I remember as a boy turning on the light in my bedroom and seeing one or two cockroaches kind of scurry across the ceiling to escape the light. So when I came across this experiment recently, it was like, wow, because the red is kind of the darkness for cockroaches because they're kind of, can't really see red, it's kind of just dark, and the white is light. And you can see the way they scurry away from the light into the darkness. This is how things go. It's pretty cool and pretty gross at the same time, isn't it? They really don't like the light. They want to hang out in the shadows. And I wonder if that's the way we could be described in many ways in different areas of our life. Because there are some things that cause us to dart to the shadows, isn't there? All of us have particular habits or traits that we don't want anyone else to see. Many of us have secrets we want to keep concealed, masked. And so we scurry away to the darkness and try to camp away out of the light in the shadows, presumably where no one will ever see us. And that's where David is as we come to our story today in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. Just 7 to 8 months earlier, before some of the things we'll look at in this passage, David had stepped into the shadows. One sinful act triggered another and another and another, and before he knew it, he hadn't just committed adultery, but he had murdered up 10 people, he had lied, he had betrayed, and he had stolen. Half of the 10 commandments were broken in just a handful of weeks. That's it. And I don't think David would ever see himself as capable of such evil, but all of this had happened to him. He never set out for it to happen. At this time, it felt like just the necessary course of action just to kind of cover things up. But after all, he was a king. And once he had committed the affair, he didn't want to kind of just leave it there. He wanted to cover his tracks and do what was necessary to keep all of this under wraps in the hopes that he could move on. And he did a pretty good job of scurrying away into the shadows, covering it all up. He acted fast to keep it all under wraps. And it looked like he had gotten away with it all, gotten away with murder. After all, what happens in the shadows stays in the shadows. I've been a pastor for some time now, and I love the vantage point that I have when I hear and see a lot of the things that go on in people's lives. I see the courageous decisions that people make, people like Beth. I see the good fights that people choose in order to renew people and places. But the vantage point I have, I also see stupid choices that people make. Nothing surprises me anymore. I've seen the way people scurry into those hidden darknesses, out of the light, presumably where no one ever sees what's going on. And when the light comes on, I've heard the excuses, I've heard the rationale, and I've heard the heartbreaking consequences of those choices. And what I've discovered is that no one thinks it will ever happen to them. It's like we at times think we're immune to such deception that could go on in our own lives. Most of the people I have spoken to are really surprised that they find where they have moved from where they once were to way off direction. I think this is probably where David felt in many ways too. You see, in a room like this, there are a number of people who are right now living in the shadows. And like David, you have done a pretty good job to cover up behaviors and actions your spouse doesn't know, your kids don't know, your friends don't know, presumably it's hidden from everyone around you. But my guess is that you're not experiencing the freedom and release you want in your life. And you want to experience that. And you still try to work out how it was that you got entangled into this messy, sticky web in the first place. And you're not sure how to get out of it. And you're scared of what it would look like to step into the light. And right now, there's this quietness and stillness in the room, isn't there? Because it's one of those times you don't want to move too much in case you kind of give yourself away or people kind of think that's you. But none of us is immune to this. See, as we look at the story about David, it's important that we grasp how easy this can well be our story. And for many here, there are parts that will resemble your story and your life right now. And I think this story about David might help all of us understand how it is that we get entangled into messes like this one and what it takes for us to move into the light and actually experience freedom and release once again. So let's look, how did David get into this mess? And how do we get into this sticky web? The story begins this way. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. It's like a throwaway beginning to the story, but the emphasis in the Hebrew text draws our attention to the very fact that David appears to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. David wasn't meant to be there, but now he has power, he is isolated, and he has time on his hands. It's a bad formula. Power plus isolation plus time equals his recipe for disaster. You know, in my context, it could be read in the time of the week when pastors do their sermon preparation, Jonathan was on the beach in Hawaii, isolated, time on his hands. See, this is not the David we know and love. Remember one of the times when we first meet David, when everyone slinks back in terror before the bully Goliath. David is into the thick of battle, madly twirling a sling around his head, flinging the stone, cutting off the giant's head. And that became David's motto. Engage life, fight oppression and evil, stay alive with God, live passionately, risk it all for the glory of God. So David fought, David prayed, David ran, David loved, David danced in everything he did. He faced life with a fully alive heart. But somehow, somewhere, maybe in the midst of all the battles, or maybe more probably in the midst of his successes, life somehow drained the passion out of David. He's a shell of that former David. And while David's army is out there on the front line, risking their lives, defending the kingdom, sweating, bleeding, dying, where's David? The commander-in-chief, the one who should be with his troops. He's at home, taking a leisurely stroll on his marble deck, waking up from a late afternoon nap. And from that perch, David surveys all the signs of his success. Because largely through his leadership, the nation is united, the economy's flourishing, the military's advancing, and this shepherd boy is now living in a palace. But watch out, David, because while we arrive at the middle stage of our life, we find that we're often the most vulnerable to destroying what we built in the very first stage of our life. Often the higher up you go in the food chain, the more isolated and inflated you become. Success can be dangerous. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of his bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. Her name is Bathsheba. She is gorgeous, is absolute stunning, head-turning knockout. David sent, just tuck that word away in your mind because it comes up like 11 times in our story. He sent someone to find out who she was. And he was told she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. I mean, all the warning flags should be going off at this point. Wife of Uriah. But David, powerful man as he is restless. Perhaps David had developed a sense of entitlement. Perhaps there was this growing weariness and cynicism in his life. Why not just bend the rules just once? So David sent, there's that word again, David sent messages to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. Then she returned home. It looks like a simple, uncomplicated affair. What's done in the shadows stays in the shadows. But then the story takes a twist. Later, when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she sent David a message saying, I'm pregnant. See, David never expected this one. Remember, so far, he's the one in control. That verb send is used 11 times in the story, and David is usually the one who sends. He sends his army. He sends his servant. He's in charge. But notice who's doing the sending now. It's not David. It's Bathsheba. For all of his masterminding of the event, there are some things that David just can't control, like the growth of an unexpected new life in the womb. Now, at this point, David could just step out into the light. He could come clean. That would be the sensible, wise, and godly thing to do, right? But David thinks that he can control the situation and conceal what he has done. He scurries away into the shadows. He sends word to his general Joab. Send me Uriah the Hittite. David sends for Bathsheba's husband Uriah. Ironically, Uriah is at war, fighting for his people, for his God, for his king, David. Ironically, Uriah is a foreigner who has made his home here among the people, and he's willing to put everything on the line for his new people, for his God, and for his king, David. When Uriah arrived, David asked him how Joab and the army were getting along and how the war was progressing, as if he cared. Then he told Uriah, hey, go home and relax. David even sent a gift to Uriah after he had left the palace. I'm imagining the gift has, the chocolates and that little dip of, the little thing of chocolate and the strawberries that you kind of dip into it, and there's some champagne there and probably, a bit of music to go along with it. And maybe Ed Sheeran's thinking out loud, everything's kind of there for the perfect night. There's a bit of wink as David sends Uriah back home. But Uriah didn't go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. David's confused. He assumes that Uriah would go home and sleep with his wife, but Uriah explains. The ark and the armies of Israel and Judah are living in tents, and Joab and my master's men are camping in the open fields. How could I go home to wine and dine and sleep with my wife? I swear that I would never do such a thing. You see, Uriah considers it wrong to sleep with his own wife while the army's engaged in Ammon. David has no such qualms. In fact, he's even happy to sleep with another man's wife during this time. David, again, takes control of the situation. He moves things to phase 2 of the cover-up. He throws a party, ensures Uriah's wine cup, overflows throughout the night. But even in a drunken state, Uriah still refuses to go home and compromise the comrades who are struggling and sweating and dying on the battlefield. At this stage, things have escalated from adultery to deceit. Now, David, again, could just kind of step into the light and come clean, but he hatches another plan and things move to phase 3 of the cover-up. He sends a note to Joab, the commander of the army, to have Uriah move to the front line to advance the enemy fire in a way that he is certain to die. He even has Uriah carry the death notice because, David knows this man is way too loyal to ever read it. General Joab reads the note but realizes that to avoid suspicion, Joab actually needs to send multiple soldiers to advance while the rest of the troops retreat. All of them are killed, including Uriah, Bathsheba's famous war hero husband. David finally gets the result he wants. Uriah is dead. And once again, David sends for Bathsheba. Once again, he takes charge, covering his tracks, asserting control. In just a handful of weeks, maybe just days, David ends up breaking the 7th commandment about adultery, the 10th about coveting another man's wife, and then in an attempt to cover up his crime, he violates at least the 9th about deceit, the 6th about murder. His actions have caused much pain and misery on a lot of innocent men, women, and children. At this stage in the story, David has it all under wraps. He swept it all under the mat, hidden in the shadows. He's able to move on with his life, leading and living well. After all, what's done in the shadows stays in the shadows. Let's just kind of pause there for a moment and reflect on some of the lessons that come into the story for us. After all, this story is written not just to kind of give us some story in the past, but actually to warn you and me about the way we live, the decisions we make, what happens when we choose to dwell in the shadows. So again, I've never met anyone who intended for something like this to happen to them. We learn, I think, that it generally starts small. Actions like this never come out of the blue. Normally there are a number of things that take place before we ever get to this point. It happens slowly, but then they can escalate really fast at some point in that journey. Power plus isolation plus time, it's a recipe for disaster. You begin to bend the rules, or you think those rules don't apply to you or don't apply today in our kind of Kiwi modern context. Your soul becomes apathetic and cynical. It's a dangerous place to be. It's true for David. Before all this, David had actually already begun to bend the rules. Maybe it came from this developed sense of entitlement. I mean, he had done so much in his military career, and he had also taken so many hits himself with criticism and the hurt while he was on the run from Saul. There's always a context. Perhaps it came from keeping up with the practices of surrounding kings. He had taken on a harem. Yet the Bible is really clear about marriage being between one man and one woman committed together for life. And those rules applied whether you were a king or a peasant in the community. But David, I guess like other kings, took on a harem, multiple wives and concubines. I guess he's living the life, showing his manliness, his power, his status. But he's playing loose on the rules. And it's good for us to kind of just consider for a moment. Am I drifting into the shadows? Is there this kind of growing sense of entitlement in my life? Am I beginning to bend the rules? Am I drifting? So, see, nobody ever looks at addiction and goes, well, that looks fun. No, nobody ever does that. Whether it's pornography or alcohol abuse or an affair, nobody looks at where it's going to end up. They just look at the first step. It always begins slowly, innocently. Nobody looks at dishonesty and see where it's going to lead. You just amend here, you adjust something again there, and the lies just increase little by little to cover things up. And before you know it, a little bit here, a little lie there, and you end up far away from where you first began. And I think if we could ever see where it would end up, I doubt whether we would ever step into it. But the problem is it happens really slowly at first. See, all of us scurry into the shadows. Something instinctively that moves us in that direction. And if you think that you are immune from anything like that, you are in an even more dangerous place than the rest of us. I think there is another aspect here too. I think it never feels like sin. David knew God's word. David wasn't ignorant of what God said about harems and affairs and murder and deceit, but it never feels wrong, does it? I don't think David ever felt like a sinner. My guess is that he felt more like a lover. He had this important role as a king, and in his mind, it was probably better for him to kind of just carry on and to gain control because, well, maybe other people would be affected, which is better for him to keep his position. The stability of the whole nation was at stake in his mind. So in a matter of weeks, one bad decision led to another and another and another. And David, in this point in the story, looks like everything's okay. Again, what stays in the shadows, happens in the shadows, stays in the shadows. Interestingly, while it looks like David has it all in control and he's back leading the nation again, internally we know that he was not a happy man. Sometime later, as he looks back to this very moment, he talks about what was going on in his soul. In one of the Psalms, we read this: "When I refused to confess my sin, my body wasted away and I groaned all day long. My strength evaporated like water in the summer heat." And some of you here can relate to that. You're keeping everything under wraps, but internally you're wrung out. And a part of you wants to just step into the light and find help once again. You see, as a pastor, my observation is that when people are in this mode, they tend to self-medicate in some way. It might be with alcohol or drugs or with illicit sex. Might get distracted with things at work and kind of take on more and more, or things at home or some kind of entertainment to try to ease the pain and distract them from dealing with the real issues. Some begin to highlight the problems of others more. Some will put more spin on their own successes. And all this, I think, is trying to medicate this internal groaning, this spiritual dehydration that's taking place within. Let's continue with David's story and see what happens next. How this intersects with our story. End of chapter 11 finishes this way. "But the Lord was displeased with what David had done." David thought it was all hidden, as so often we do. But God sees everything. Later, David would write in one of his Psalms, I could ask the darkness to hide me and the light around me to become night, but even the darkness I cannot hide from you. To you, the night shines as bright as day. Darkness and light are the same to you. We can't scurry away. We scurry into the shadows, but God sees everything that we do in the shadows. And He will get our attention somehow and do whatever is necessary for us to address it. Over in the book of Hebrews, we read, the Lord disciplines those He loves. He punishes each one He accepts as His child. As you endure this divine discipline, remember that God is treating you as His own children. God's discipline is always good for us. Might be hard, but good, that we might share in His holiness. No discipline is enjoyable while it's happening. It's painful. But afterward, there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. See, God doesn't want to avoid us being in pain. He wants to bring things into the light, and He will do whatever it takes for us to experience healthy life because we are His beloved children. So God sends Nathan to David. It's that word again, send. Up until this point, again, it's basically David doing the sending, David hiding, David in charge. And it's like God is finally saying, hey, David, it's me. I'm the one in charge here. You think you've got it all in control, but you really don't. So Nathan turns up, God's prophet, and he comes and gives David a really simple story. A story about a rich man who had some house guests staying with him, and he needed some lamb chops. But rather than take a lamb from his own vast flocks, he steals a sweet little lamb from his poor neighbor. The outrage of it all, the poor man has fed this little lamb just like he was a puppy. He's held the lamb in his lap. The lamb he started to call Lammy, grows up and he drinks out of the poor man's bowl. But this rich man has now stolen it, butchered it, and cooked it. And David hears the story and he's morally outraged about it. David is furious, we read. As surely as the Lord lives, he vowed, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. He must repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one he stole and for having no pity. And then Nathan closes his masterful trap. You, David, are that man. Suddenly David's defenses are flattened. It's like the light has been turned on and David stands exposed before a judge who sees everything. Before we look at the way David responds and the need for us to respond, I'm going to say something here about Nathan. See, most of us don't like the role of playing Nathans in anybody's life. We don't like the role of truth-telling. And yet, and if anyone actually does like that role, you probably need to pay attention to the way Nathan goes about it here. Because Nathan's goal is not condemnation, it's conviction. He tells his well-crafted story in the hope that David will put down his defenses. I mean, he could have come in with verses and, evidence all blazing, and David could have kicked him out and he could have felt justified in what he did. But David is about transformation. This is what God is after. Not condemnation, but a conviction that will lead to transformation. And at times, we need to take on the role of David in the lives of other people that we love. See, Nathan has taken this huge risk here. David has already covered things up and been prepared to murder for it. He could well do it again. And yet even knowing that, Nathan steps in and he brings the truth to David with much thought and with much love. And perhaps some of you here in this room need to actually be a Nathan in the life of somebody else right now and come to them with truth and with much, much love. And it will be hard and it will be terrifying. We also need to have Nathans in our own life. People who are willing to step in and speak the truth to us in love. I was reading this week over in Hebrews that you must warn each other every day while it's still called today, so that none of you will be deceived by sin and hardened against God. See, it's almost like we can have these blinkers on in our life and we see particular things, but we can't see other things that go on in our lives. And sometimes we need a friend, a Nathan, that can step into our lives and can kind of turn on the lights so we can actually see these other parts to us. And that can't happen on Facebook. It can't happen via text. This is like face-to-face meeting with people, one of these kind of novelties that we're kind of losing in our communities, isn't it? I have a couple of Nathans in my life that I meet face to face. We have often meet just for coffee or lunch, and they have permission to step in and speak to me about anything, any trends they see going on in my life. I have others that love me well enough that they would do that in my own life because they have my best interests at heart. Make sure that you too have Nathans around you. Talk to someone in your small group. Arrange to have coffee with someone this week just to simply say, hey, I really like you to speak to me about things you see in my life so that I can address them and get some help. And if you don't know what to do with any of that, again, just to remind you, we have this email address, support@gcc.org.nz. Whenever you email that, there will always be somebody to respond with practical, emotional, spiritual help, and we'll come around whatever you need. Be a Nathan and ensure that you have Nathans in your own life. But back to our story. How does David respond to Nathan? Yes, he's been brought into the light, he's been exposed. But again, he could have well controlled what happens at this point. He could have had Nathan killed like he did Uriah. But this time, David makes a choice to step into the light and stay in the light. He's not going to cover anything up anymore. It's this humble step. And surprisingly, this step is going to be what leads him to freedom and release. And the steps that he takes, I think, helps us know what it looks like in this journey too. It begins with confession. David confessed to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. You know, that sentence is just 2 words in Hebrew. It's a simple phrase. That is simple words. There's no formula. I've sinned against the Lord. In fact, it's really more than just the words itself. It's really about the heart. Interestingly, those same words are used earlier by David's predecessor, Saul. When Saul sinned, he used these same words, but he wasn't really repentant. And the difference is that before using them, Saul tried to deflect what he had done. He argued his case, trying to stay in the shadows. And it was only when those strategies failed that he confessed using that same language, but he would go on and just wanted to move on and get back to the way things were, never wanting to accept the consequences. He wasn't really repentant. What I want you to notice here is that David blames no one. He owns up to what he has done without reservation. I have sinned against the Lord. And that is the very first step, coming from a heart that means that, where you can experience release and freedom and hope again. And shortly at the end of this service, I'm going to give you an opportunity to do just that as you step into a loving, gracious community who can journey with you. But that confession still leads to consequences. And the consequences is a word that none of us likes. Most of us fear the light coming on because of the consequences. But even with genuine confession, there are still consequences. Most of us try to dodge them. But there are some things that just come naturally. You know, you reap what you sow. You jump off a tall building, you're going to hit the concrete. It's not like the cartoons anymore. And consequences aren't a popular word, are they? Personally, I like to avoid talking about this part, but because we value truth, kind of need to mention it. David will feel the consequences of his actions. And God allows nature to take its course, even with a sincere confession. So when David is confronted by Nathan about this rich farmer taking on the lamb, he said the rich farmer should repay fourfold. And effectively, that's what David has to pay, fourfold. He loses 4 sons as his family becomes terribly fragmented and dysfunctional. David loses a baby conceived to Bathsheba. Then one of his sons rapes his half-sister, is killed by another brother out of revenge. Eventually, 4 sons die. All of the deaths are premature. 3 of them were violent. And when you delve into the story in the succeeding chapters, you begin to see how David's sins are echoed by his sons, who simply follow in their father's footsteps. And there are these word plays in the story showing us that this directly relates to what David had done and the way you reap what you sow. David learns what it feels like to be on the receiving ends. He discovered that there are consequences for our actions that are inevitable. And to be honest, these consequences would have occurred with or without confession. But then confession leads to something else. It's forgiveness. Straight after David says, I've sinned against the Lord, we read, yes, by Nathan, the Lord has forgiven you, and you won't die for the sin. God is going to hold back some of the capital punishment that was warranted for what David did. And yes, there would be other consequences, but there was forgiveness and grace that would come immediately. David's past would not be a barrier for his future. The Bible uses a whole lot of different pictures for forgiveness that are all true in this situation. It talks about being healed like a disease, forgotten like a fleeting thought, stomped underfoot, thrown behind the back or thrown into the depth of the sea, blotted, erased, wiped out, washed, separated from the east as far as the east is from the west, covered over. David receives all of this as he is forgiven. And when any of us simply confesses, God is faithful and just to forgive us for our sin. You see, there is another courtroom where another one stood one day. Just as Nathan stepped in and used those words, behold the man, those words were shared in another courtroom too. But this time it was not David standing trial, it was Jesus. Jesus standing in our place, this time is the one accused in our place. And he was in the dock when he should have been the one accusing in the role of Nathan. But he stood in the dock. And this time nothing was held back. He took on the death sentence. And the judge of the whole earth who did nothing wrong is taking on our stuff and takes on the consequences for what we do. So when we come to Jesus and we confess what we have done, there is this grace upon grace upon grace. And we receive it through confession, stepping out of the shadows into the light. See, some of you right now are trying to hide in the shadows. And you're wrestling even right now with what to do with the stuff that's going on inside. And I need to remind you that we believe in the gospel here. And it's not something that just affects our life right at the beginning when we say yes to Jesus, but it matters every day because every day we mess up. The good news is that this gospel steps in and helps, that the cross of Jesus atones for what we have done. And all it takes is for us to humbly say, I have sinned. But with that act comes this pardon, comes this freedom, comes this release. It's with that act there is hope again. It's with that act you experience the gracious hand of God and the gracious hand of a community journeying with you through all that needs to happen. See, there's a beautiful scene at the end of the story where Nathan comes back to talk to David. Bathsheba's had another son. They name him Solomon. But this time Nathan comes back and God says, I want you to change his name to Jedediah. Do you know what Jedediah means? Beloved of the Lord. The last visit of Nathan was one of confrontation, but this time Nathan comes and he says, hey, this is what God is saying to you, David. This is how God feels about you and your family. Beloved of the Lord. The past does not have to be a barrier to the future. And in fact, as Scripture looks over David's life and God effectively has this epitaph of David's life at the end, we read things like this from 1 Kings chapter 11. In Solomon's old age, they turned his heart to worship other gods instead of being completely faithful to the Lord as God, as his father David had been. And you kind of go, what? And it goes on to the next one, as his father David had done, as David had chosen to do, and right down to chapter 15, verse 5, for David had done what was pleasing in the Lord's sight and obeyed the Lord's commandments throughout his life, except in the affair concerning Uriah the Hittite. And you kind of sit back and you go, that's kind of a big except. A lot of things happen in that. And yet this is the way David looks, the way God looks at David's life. He sees a man who loves him, a man who confesses what he has done, a man who accepts the consequences of those actions and passionately pursues God once again. The past did not affect the way God loved him or the difference he would make. And I want to give you the opportunity this morning to sit quietly before God and just say what needs to be said. The ushers are going to come and pass out communion. The bread and cup reminds us of the consequences Jesus absorbed for you and for me, and the grace and the pardon and the hope that is available to us. As they come, I just want to encourage you to sit quietly and talk to Jesus about what's going on in your life. In a moment, I'm going to come and I'm going to lead us in prayer. And then a little later, I'm going to give you the opportunity to come and actually receive help and to be prayed for power as you kind of step into some courageous decisions in your life. Let's take the bread and the cup, hold it in our hand, as we consider what this story means in our stories.